10, please stand by.
From the EWTN radio and television studios, this is EWTN Theology Roundtable, a conversation with the experts of EWTN's Department of Theology. Got questions about the liturgy, scripture, or tradition? They have the answers. Now, EWTN Theology Roundtable.
Welcome to EWTN Theology Roundtable, right here live on EWTN Radio, and will air on EWTN Television in a couple of weeks. And today's topic is the joy of love, Pope Francis' Apostolic Exhortation Amoris Laetitia, by its name in Latin. You're welcome to call in with your questions. We have our expert panel here to show and share about the impact for the Church of this apostolic exhortation. We have with us, and we welcome to the show, Colin Donovan, who is the Vice President of the Theology Department here at EWTN and our host on EWTN Theology Roundtable. And our expert panelists are Laura Dittis and Cindy Cuellar. Welcome, ladies. Both are panelists and theology advisors here at EWTN. Colin, the topic of Amoris Laetitia is a very hot topic. We want to go ahead and open up our lines. Our call screener, Matt Kubinski, is ready to take your calls at 1-800-585-9396. The number again is 1-800-585-9396. I'm Elena Rodriguez, and I'm delighted to be with you to talk about a very important topic and the impact to the Church of this apostolic exhortation by Pope Francis. Colin, really, it's generated a lot of controversy, but is it really that confusing? You have studied it.
Well, you know, I think you could use an analogy that's sometimes made in such cases, and that is, it seems to have generated more heat than light so far. But I think we've seen in the last couple weeks, if you recall, that this was released the week after Mother died. So we did a program that day on Mother Angelica with the friars. And so here we are a month later. We've had time to digest the exhortation. And a lot of the heat, as it were, the noise has settled down. It clearly has been controversial, people homing in on footnotes, people homing in on the chapter 8 and the pastoral guidance and insights there. And I think we've started to see it shake out a little bit, where we're getting a little bit more, sort of rational guidance taking place. I would point to at least two things. And this is a practice we've always encouraged. When we talked about the Pope's encyclical earlier in the year, we've always taken this approach, and we'll continue to do so. But I would point to two things, one of which was an interview given by Bishop Athanasius Schneider of Kazakhstan. And in it he talked about a couple of things, and I would say the two takeaways that I got from reading what he had to say was what we'll be talking today about, and that is reading this from a proper hermeneutic and understanding it according to the mind of the Church, and not isolating it and doing it in sort of a fundamentalist fashion. And the other thing was ambiguities. How do you deal with the things which seem to be ambiguous? And I think that's an area that a second article which I came across recently on the site Chiesa, which is the blog of Sandra Magister, an Italian Vaticanista, a commentator on things Catholic, things Vatican. And it was an article by a Dominican priest, Father Angelo Bellon, called Instructions for Reading the Post-Synodal Exhortation Amoris Laetitia. And he makes some points which we've made before on our roundtables, and that is this distinction between a hermeneutic of continuity and a hermeneutic of dissent or dissonance or discontinuity. And that he says the principle of interpretation is the documents of the Magisterium, including those on moral issues, must be interpreted according to hermeneutic of continuity and of development. And he specifically says, and not according to that of discontinuity, rupture, or transformation with respect to the perennial magisterium. And on the basis of that, as he goes through his article, he explains how you can apply this in the so-called controverted cases, in these ambiguous areas. to understand rightly, in accordance with the perennial magisterium, how this, what the Pope is saying, and also out of respect for the Pope himself and for his office, not jumping to sort of the worst case conclusions or the worst interpretation. He calls it the in peiorum partem, looking at things in the very worst light, in the very worst way. But rather he encourages us in meiorum partem, or meliorum partem, looking at things in the better way and in the better light. And when you do that, it resolves ambiguities, it resolves difficulties. So I think we want to do that today, and a good place to start is with what the Church has said about interpreting documents.
Sure.
And the Second Vatican Council is certainly one of the most recent instances of giving us clues or guidance regarding the proper interpretation of popes and of magisterial documents in general.
Yes. Lumen Gentium 25 does give us some guidelines in how to receive a magisterial document, even when the Pope's not speaking ex cathedra. And so it speaks of a certain reverence for the author's office, and we should approach documents with a certain trust in the Holy Father's person and office, upholding the honor due to him, beginning maybe with a certain docility rather than a tendency to rash criticism or scrutiny. And the way that Lumen Gentium speaks of this, it says, religious submission of mind and will must be shown in a special way to the authentic magisterium of the Roman Pontiff, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra. That is, it must be shown in such a way that his supreme magisterium is acknowledged with reverence. The judgments made by him are sincerely adhered to according to his manifest mind and will. And so one might ask the question, how do we know the mind and will of the Holy Father? And that's also, we're given some direction on that as well. We can know his mind and will not as a presumption, but, quote, from the character of the documents, from his frequent repetition of the same doctrine, or from his manner of speaking, end quote. So there's three things there. Character of the document. So a document can be pastoral, dogmatic, legislative, and so this one has more of a pastoral character to it.
And he himself describes its true character
Yes.
as not trying to change anything or establish any legal prescriptions, or he's very clear on what he means it to be.
Yes, and then also each document carries its own level of authority. So this is called a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. So that so level of authority of documents, you have constitutions, encyclicals, apostolic letters, exhortations. So there's a number of different kinds of both speeches and addresses as well as writings that the Holy Father will give us. And then the second point, frequent repetition. So whether that be by Pope Francis, if he's saying something a lot, or as well as other Holy Fathers. Is this something the Church has repeated again and again? Is this something that the Church has always taught? And then
I think in keeping with what Father Bellon says too, that if there's going to be any dogmatic development, it will occur in a progressive and continuous way through this repetitiveness of different popes repeating in the same teaching, so that it's clear that this is something that the Roman Magisterium is adhering to and pushing, if you will, to use a vernacular there.
Yes, and then the third point, from his manner of speaking. So in a same document, you could have some things that are suggestions versus things that are obligations. And so one example you could give in this document is he speaks of how a couple preparing for marriage should consecrate their love before an image of the Blessed Mother. Now that's a great thing for couples to do, but it doesn't mean that if a couple hadn't done that before they got married, that they're not married or anything like that. So that carries more the idea of a suggestion, and we should read those things as suggestions. And then another document that speaks to how to read documents. We have something from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1990, and that document is called Donum Veritatis, on the ecclesial vocation of the theologian. And that document gives theologians criteria for when you come across difficulties in a document, how to deal positively with those. And so these things can become a dynamic factor, a stimulus to both the magisterium and theologians to fulfill their roles and to practice dialogue. And as we look at these documents, we're to try to seek unity of truth and also the unity of charity. And so the principle of charity should always be involved in our reading. And, you know, if a theologian does find something to present a contrary opinion, that's to be done with humility and not as unarguable. So to realize maybe there is something that I didn't see there, to be willing to change his opinions if necessary. And then if this difficulty continues, to bring it up to the right authorities in the church, in the spirit of being at the service of the truth and the people of God. So it's not, you know, just trying to make headlines, but really to be at the service of the church.
And especially in the cases of those things which are not well defined in the magisterium, you know, that it's going to be by a progressive growth and not a radical change. And so people have to dispose themselves and others, and I think that docility is a key thing. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because a lot of people seem to be taking the position, well, I have nothing to learn from this Pope. I don't like what he says here. The reality, as we'll find out after the break, is that there's a lot of very positive pastoral and theological elements in this exhortation. And we'll look at those when we come back from the break.
In a moment, EWTN Theology Roundtable continues, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if there is such, in this document, The Joy of Love, Pope Francis' Apostolic Exhortation. Here on EWTN, the lines are open, 1-800-585-9396. That number again, 1-800-585-9396. Now is a great time to call EWTN Theology Roundtable.
This is EWTN.
From EWTN News Nightly in Washington, D.C., I'm Lauren Ashburn. Pope Francis receives the International Charlemagne Prize today. It's awarded annually for contributions to European unity. In his speech, the Holy Father says, "I dream of a Europe where being a migrant is not a crime." Donald Trump says he's meeting with Speaker of the House Paul Ryan next week. This comes after the highest-ranking Republican says he's not ready to support Trump as the presumptive nominee. Trump says he's surprised but not bothered by the comments. Federal investigators have interviewed several of Hillary Clinton's closest aides in connection to her private email server. Critics claim she made classified information vulnerable to hackers. And the new Swiss Army Guard recruits take an oath to protect Pope Francis at the Vatican. The motto, courage and loyalty. Pontifical Swiss Guard is the oldest in the world.
Most men will do almost anything to avoid deep theological discussions. Well, you don't need a doctorate in theology to listen to and enjoy the Catholic Cafe. Join me, Deacon Jeff Drzymski, along with my trusty sidekick Tom Dorian, as we try and make manly sense out of living the Catholic faith.
The Catholic Cafe, Saturdays at 4 p.m. Eastern and Sundays at 5 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Live truth, live Catholic.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television. Join our conversation with your question or comment. Call us toll-free, 1-800-585-9396. Outside the United States and Canada, call 1-205-271-2985 or send us an email, etr@ewtn.com.
EWTN Theology Roundtable continues here on EWTN. You can join our discussion with Colin Donovan, Cindy Cuellar, and Laura Dittis, our theologians from EWTN's think tank, the Department of Theology, here talking about the Apostolic Exhortation from Pope Francis that recently came out, Amoris Laetitia, by its title in Latin, The Joy of Love. The lines are open, 1-800-585-9396. If you are outside the United States or Canada, you can call us as well, 1-205-271-2985. Colin, what is there of good, of bad, of ugly? You have the word.
Well, there's a lot of good, and I think so much energy has been expended, and ink, if you will, too,
Sure.
although much of it digital ink as opposed to the normal kind, on the issues of the so-called controversial sections that I think a lot of people have missed the not advances, but the very sound pastoral advice, the reaffirmation of long-standing moral teaching. In every respect, as the Pope himself has said, faithful son of the Church, he is promoting the doctrine of the Church in moral areas and really going out with his sword against gender ideology as an example of one area. And, as we were talking about the Lumen Gentium in Vatican II, talking about being docility towards the Pope, it's an element, St. Thomas Aquinas would tell us, of docility to be teachable. And the Holy Father actually has a very good deal to teach us.
Yes, he does.
In large swaths of this exhortation.
Yes, the Holy Father, in fact, he affirms the Church's teaching on several topics, such as abortion, contraception, gender ideology, as you just mentioned, parental rights, the right that parents have to educate their children, conscientious objection. He touches on all of these and affirms the Church's teaching. For instance, on the topic of abortion, in paragraph 42, the Holy Father states, "The Church strongly rejects the forced state intervention in favor of contraception, sterilization, and even abortion." So he's very clear on this. And then he also talks about adoption versus abortion in paragraph 179, where he encourages and calls for legislation that helps facilitate the adoption process, versus that of abortion. On the topic of contraception, he places an emphasis on the need to return to the teaching of Humanae Vitae and Familiaris Consortio. In paragraph 82, he states, "We need to return to the message of the encyclical Humanae Vitae of Blessed Pope Paul VI, which highlights the need to respect the dignity of the person in morally assessing methods of regulating birth." And then he brings in the Apostolic Exhortation Familiaris Consortio and says that it ought to be taken up anew in order to counter a mentality that is often hostile to life. On the issue of conscience protection, he says that those who work in healthcare facilities are reminded of their moral duty of conscientious objection. And the topic that people seem to have lost sight of here is he also touches on gender ideology. For instance, the same-sex unions. The Holy Father affirms the Church's teachings and states, "As for proposals to place unions between homosexual persons on the same level as marriage, there are absolutely no grounds for considering homosexual unions to be in any way similar or even remotely analogous to God's plan for marriage and family." He also covers in paragraph 172 same-sex parents and adoption, that whole issue. And then also families who have members that experience same-sex attraction. He brings in the catechism in paragraph 250 and talks about where he talks about the Synod Fathers having discussions where they would like, before all else, to reaffirm that every person, regardless of sexual orientation, ought to be respected in his or her dignity and treated with consideration. Well, every sign of unjust discrimination is to be carefully avoided. So that's what the Catechism teaches on those who do struggle with same-sex attraction. And the one that I just really jumped up and down on was parental rights, because that's such a hot topic today. And he just really brings it home in paragraph 84, where he states very clearly that overall education of children is a most serious duty. And at the same time, it's a primary right of parents. And then he goes on and he talks about what the state's role is, what the school's role is, and then he goes back to describe the primary rights of parents as a basic principle. All other participants in the process of education are only able to carry out their responsibilities in the name of the parents, with their consent, and to a certain degree with their authorization. So parents, it's your primary right to educate your children, and don't let anyone convince you otherwise.
You know, in the document when discussing marriage and how a pastor or a confessor should deal with a person who comes to them divorced and remarried, and they have their struggles, they feel locked into situations, he talks about conscience. It's interesting that a lot of these issues you just discussed were issues of conscience, where the consciences of the state are being put above the conscience of the parent, of the healthcare worker, of the government that doesn't want to have abortion and contraception, but maybe the international agency that is forcing them to get in order to get loans to violate their own consciences. The issue of conscience is important in these other issues, but I think the conscience issue is also important in terms of his document and the subject matter of people in second marriages that are irregular, not following an annulment, because he's always talking throughout the document, and this is a theme that runs through it, and that is bringing people to the truth. Here he's, of course, talking about states trying to impose something on people who possess the truth against their will, impose it against their will. But bringing people to the truth so that opening themselves to God and the truth, they accept the truth. And so I think, again, conscience seems to be an area, I don't know what your thoughts are, where it seems like, some people have tried to find a very negative theme in there. It's the autonomous conscience. No, he's specifically opposed to the absolutely autonomous conscience, whether it's the state or the individual, because the truth he's constantly talking about, helping them in the path of discernment.
And I think it's almost bringing someone to encounter Christ in those moments too, that you really need to encounter the truth. It's a personal thing that people need to come to it, and there's various routes along which that happens, but the Holy Father really wants those moments of conversion to be made possible.
And I want to remind our listeners and viewers, you can call in with your questions for Colin Donovan, Laura Dittis, and Cindy Quare here by dialing 1-205-271-2985. That is our international number, 1-205-271-2985. You can also call our 1-800 number. That is 1-800-585-9396. That number again is 1-800-585-9396 with your questions about the joy of love, Pope Francis' Apostolic Exhortation here on EWTN Theology Roundtable. Good opportunity for you to ask your questions to our theologians about special marriage situations as well.
Yeah, and we're not canon lawyers, but we'll give the best advice we can. And I think, you're raising that issue makes me think of another element of the conscience, and that is people in their private situations, as would be the case of a couple who maybe regrets the way their first marriage was handled and the way they exited it. The Pope gives advice to pastors as to how to encourage them to think and come to an understanding, proper self-knowledge of their role in that situation and where they are now. And I think, not being in that situation ourselves, we can't imagine what an intimate revelation that must be to a person to discuss these even with a priest, and how hard it is, and not to make light of that path, as if you can simply say to a person, the moral law says this, you must stop. Now you can say this is what God says, but at the same time you have to accompany the person, as the Pope says, that they come to accept that they have a responsibility to that truth. And I think that's the hard part of the discernment the Pope is talking about. We're all different with different burdens and obstacles to accepting the truth, and he really wants priests to do a difficult work.
And we continue in a moment with EWTN Theology Roundtable here with Colin Donovan, Laura Dittis, and Cindy Quare, our theologians here at EWTN, talking about the joy of love. Pope Francis' Apostolic Exhortation. The number to call, 1-800-585-9396 with your questions about the joy of love. 1-800-585-9396. Stay tuned.
All of our advances in social networking and communication are amazing, but if we don't keep it all in place, we might end up in touch with the news of the day, 1,000, quote, friends online, and 1 million work emails, but we lose touch with the most important things in life, like the people right in front of us, and God revealing Himself to us through the experiences of daily life. I know it's not easy, but you have to seize the silence. Carve out moments to unplug, read a book, say a prayer, or just stand in the sun and take a deep breath. All the noise will be waiting for you when you're done, but you'll face it all a little differently. In the words of Mother Teresa, the fruit of silence is prayer, the fruit of prayer is faith, the fruit of faith is love, the fruit of love is service, and the fruit of service is peace. If you don't have peace, go back to step 1. Got silence? This is Chris Stefanik from reallifecatholic.com on EWTN Radio.
60 Seconds with Father Mitch Pacwa.
But so as to emphasize the gratuitous nature of salvation. In other words, what does it mean by it's gratuitous? You can't earn the grace of salvation. Nothing we do deserves salvation. I can't do enough good acts to save myself. That's heresy. The church declared that heresy in the time of Pelagius, back in the 4th century. And we don't believe it now. It is gratuitous because it's given by God's grace, freely, undeservedly. You don't deserve salvation. You don't deserve the forgiveness of sins. But you get it anyway. And this is a great, great gift for us. So we want to emphasize the gratuitous nature of salvation.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable, where we take your questions about all matters and topics of theology. Today on EWTN Theology Roundtable, we are talking about the joy of love, Pope Francis' Apostolic Exhortation, and we have our experts to take your questions. Colin Donovan is the Vice President of Theology here and the host of our show, along with our theology advisors, Cindy Quare and Laura Dittis. We have our lines open, 1-800-585-9396. That number again is 1-800-585-9396. If you're just now joining us in this special broadcast, welcome. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and join us for the rest and the remainder of this 30 minutes of this hour. We go to Frank, who is listening in Abbeville, Louisiana. And Frank is listening to EWTN Radio through Christ Our King Radio. Frank, what is your question for Colin, Laura, and for Cindy? Go ahead with your question, please. Frank, can you hear us? Let's see, let's try again. Frank, can you hear us? Hello, Frank. Welcome to EWTN Theology Roundtable. What's your question?
My question is a little bit about, introduced a little bit by the person who gave that introduction and the discussion you all had about docility, remember, teachability, responding to the office of the papacy with a teachable attitude. I have a very specific question that may seem unusual. I have been to graduate school and I've studied theology, but the two don't go together. That's not my specialty. It reflects a different point of view, perhaps. I wonder if part of what we see the Pope doing in so many things throughout his papacy is trying to let the medium be the message, in a sense, trying to disturb, as a teacher often will, trying to cause us to force ourselves as parishes and as individuals to come to look at things afresh, to come to discuss things afresh, to be uncomfortable, and a docility to that, if that is in fact in the Holy Spirit, has brought from the church where he comes from and the community of Jesuits that he comes from and the continent that he comes from and the experience that he comes from, he comes to bring that, then mere docility to the language and to the specifics and merely worrying about that without entering into that spirit of allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable so something new can come forth. And when I say new, I don't mean turning into a new religion or going off to some horrible doctrinal crisis, but we can't only be thinking those things. The word new, of course, as you know, in the New Testament and the writings of the saints and throughout the liturgy is a good thing, right? Something is new. We talk about it at Easter. We talk about it in the liturgy of the hours. I mean, new is not supposed to be bad. It's supposed to be good.
Yeah, I mean, there could very well be. The truth makes a lot of people uncomfortable, I think, Cindy. That's certainly, whether it's immediately in the front of his mind as a methodology, I don't know, but...
Yeah, and one of the things that we have to be mindful of is, always in charity. Everything, if you read this exhortation in its entirety, you can see that message of mercy. Mercy is throughout, and mercy always goes out to comfort the afflicted. So there are many members in the church who are, for one way or another, have been afflicted, and they're hurting, and this is one way pastorally that you can comfort them and help them to come to the truth that we've been talking about. But it's a gentle process. You don't take a Bible and hit them over the head with it, because you're not going to get anywhere taking that approach. So we always want to comfort the afflicted in a loving sense. It's called I'm thinking of Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. This is how we do it in love. If you take a child that's hurt and fallen and so on, it's done with mercy. It's done with a nurturing sense to help them to get back up again.
And there will be people, of course, who will be offended by that, and other people who will be comforted, just because we're all hearing it from different places. Our Lord himself, said that he, not to bruise the reed or quench the wick. So the truth can be difficult. It can be a two-edged sword, and sever a person from their comfortable sinfulness on the one hand. But the difficulty for most of us is we only think we're comfortable in sin, because if you know something is wrong, or if you have an inkling that it's wrong, then it's really a mercy to enlighten regarding the truth, isn't it?
And I think also, too, the point the caller makes about being uncomfortable so we can grow, sometimes going to confession isn't super comfortable. I mean, I think there is the comfort that comes after that, but I think some people, it takes a little effort to make that first step. And it's a pruning process, and it's a cutting off of that in us that needs pruning, and allowing that new growth to happen. And one thing I think that happens in the document, the caller talked about things that are new. The Holy Father really brings together both the Old and the New. He brings passages from the Old Testaments and as well as the New Testament in some beautiful ways. The first chapter of the document really brings forth a lot of scriptures on the family in ways I really hadn't seen done before. And also his the way that he gives a meditation on 1 Corinthians 13. It's a very beautiful passage for married couples, for persons preparing for marriage, really something that each of us can kind of really ask ourselves, what is this? What am I called to live here? Because I think there's really a challenge for each of us that we can do that bit of pruning and growth. So,
I have to agree with Frank. I think it will make people uncomfortable. There will be those who are living in sin. There will be those who are living in a sinful state and are coming to realize how they got themselves into it and the difficulty of getting themselves out of it. But I think it also must make priests uncomfortable. In this sense, I think we were talking about this morning. I think the Holy Father has raised a very high standard of accompaniment, of helping a person discern. And if you have 5, 10, 15, 20 couples in your parish that are in this situation, how do you do that? You have to do triage and to find out which ones I can help and which ones I maybe can't, or which ones I can direct to the tribunal or the new revised process, and which ones are not ready for that and need to have a accompaniment, towards making a good confession at some point. I think a lot of priests are probably a little nervous as to how do I live up to the standard of gentle mercy and not quenching the wick and not, harming the soul that the Holy Father, is calling them to do in order to bring healing to as many wounded people in the church as possible.
You can call in with your questions as well here on EWTN Theology Roundtable. The number is 1-800-585-9396. That number again is 1-800-585-9396. Plenty of time for you to call in. That's what Bridget did. She is listening in Wake Forest, Illinois to EWTN Radio through EWTN.com. Bridget, Colin Donovan, Cindy Quare, and also Laura Dittis that are attentively listening to your question. Please go ahead, Bridget.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm calling in because I feel like I sort of represent the other side of Chapter 8. I am the discarded spouse. My husband left me for another Catholic woman. We are not annulled. He is openly dating her. And after this document came out the next week, my pastor, who's also their pastor, reached out to them to return to the church and to communion. And I realized that this might be a pastoral misinterpretation of the document, or maybe taking it too far. I mean, this isn't even a quote-unquote irregular union. It's just they're not married. But there's really nothing in Chapter 8 that talks about the treatment of the person in my situation. It just seems like the mercy is really being applied only to the people who refuse to change. And the language that says things like people who have found themselves in these situations. Well, people have placed themselves in these situations.
Very good point.
And there are victims to those decisions. And I feel like the victims are being completely disregarded in this because, as my pastor's interpreting, there is no requirement for these people to make any changes. And
I don't know, if I might jump in here, I don't know how he can say that in light of the clear language. If he set them down, or if a priest set down any two couples, and let's say they are recently in a new relationship, which would then probably also here apply to your husband's situation, and one asks oneself the questions that the Pope says form an examination of conscience for such individuals about my former spouse, about my marriage, about my children, about my contribution, about the possibility of reconciliation. I think if he has not read that part of the exhortation, because there can be no healing either of them or of you without knowledge of the truth. And those questions the Pope puts in there are precisely aimed at getting at the truth, not putting, Neosporin and a Band-Aid on it, so that it looks pretty, but it's still festering underneath. So I hope that he didn't think through his answer to you, and that he has a better answer than the one you were given, because I think, especially in a very new context, a very newly created situation, there is responsibility that has to be met. And as many commentators have said, when you apply the hermeneutic of continuity to this document, there is no basis in the Catholic moral tradition for what you were told, which ignores reparation for sin already done and past, maybe or maybe not, maybe it needs to be forgiven, maybe he needs to go to confession, That all of that is true, which your pastor apparently was trying to get him to do. Then the marital resolving the issue of you're in his first marriage and his new situation, that's a whole other kettle of fish. That's the Pope has tried to make that clear, I think, that getting people to acknowledge the truth and to confess is one thing, and then the issue of returning to the sacraments otherwise involves other factors which then have to be looked into, not to mention the question of the resolution of the first marriage, which can and ought to include the possibility of reconciliation, because if a person is at fault, then you would think that reparation for that includes restoring what one took, which means oneself out of that relationship. So I hope, Bridget, and we'll pray that your pastor will come up with a different solution that is more a correct application of what the Pope has said, because I don't read that in what the Pope wrote at all.
Does that answer your question, Bridget?
It does. He's relying and referencing the conscience elements and saying, according to their consciences, this is an acceptable relationship. And my feeling is just that in the secular world, people's consciences are male-formed.
Well, that's again, that's not how you would read a Catholic document. A Catholic document has a context, Catholic teaching, and in Catholic teaching, you know what that relationship is, especially if it's a very new one. Respecting their consciences is a lot easier, I think, when 15 years ago a marriage broke up and now a couple is in a parish who have been together for 12 years. Those certainly kinds of situations may give a different answer, but I think when somebody leaves somebody and then starts appearing with somebody else, there's something else going on. I can't see that being applied. I think he's woefully misreading the document. Woefully.
And when EWTN Theology continues, we will keep taking your questions at 1-800-585-9396. That number again is 1-800-585-9396. Today talking about the joy of love, Pope Francis' Apostolic Exhortation on the family and marriage, with our experts Colin Donovan, Cindy Quayer, and Laura Dittus, our theologians here at EWTN. EWTN Theology Roundtable continues in a moment. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I'm Raymond Arroyo with Mother Angelica, A Remarkable Life. In 1959, Sister Angelica was very intent on founding a monastery in Birmingham, Alabama. The one thing she lacked was cash. While flipping through popular mechanics here at Santa Clara in Canton, Ohio, she happened upon an ad for fishing lure parts. She decided to invest in a box, and she and the sisters created an assembly line. They would later market and sell the fishing lures, raising the thousands needed to build their monastery in Birmingham. Incidentally, in 1961, Sports Illustrated would give her an award for a special contribution to a sport. Stay with EWTN as we celebrate the life of Mother Mary Angelica.
It's new. It's Catholic. It's live from our studios at Christ Cathedral. Call Me Catholic with Peggy Normandin. A full hour of talk, interviews, and commentary on faith. Celebrating, exploring, and restoring our Catholic identity in a modern world. Call Me Catholic every Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to EWTN Theology Roundtable on EWTN Radio and Television. Join our conversation with your question or comment. Call us toll-free, 1-800-585-9396. Outside the United States and Canada, call 1-205-271-2985 or send us an email, etr@ewtn.com.
That's right. We are checking email at etr@ewtn.com during the show. You can also give us a call, 1-800-585-9396, to talk to our theologians, Colin Donovan, Cindy Quayer, and Laura Dittis, here and today on EWTN Theology Roundtable, talking about the joy of love, Amoris Laetitia by its name in Latin, Pope Francis' recent Apostolic Exhortation. And I want to remind our radio listeners that this show is airing on EWTN Television on Sunday, May the 15th at 9 p.m. Eastern. So you could tune in and catch whatever you didn't get of the show. You can look at it again and maybe take some. If you happen to be driving right now, please be safe. You can always take a look at the show a little bit later, and that is always good. Mary is listening in Michigan. And Mary, you have a question for Colin Donovan, for Laura Dittis and Cindy Quayer. We are hearing you loud and clear. Go ahead, Mary, please.
Okay, well, I have a situation, kind of a double situation, where I have a sister who's married by the Justice of the Peace. We're all raised cradle Catholic. I have two siblings I have one who's married outside the Catholic Church in a marriage to a man who's in a third marriage with her. Her first marriage was not annulled. And then, and she drops in for the sacraments if every time she'll take the Eucharist if there's a First Holy Communion or a funeral mass or something. And then I have a brother who I'm very close to. I'm not close to my sister. We used to be, but we're not now. And I'm very close to my brother who's got a pastoral position in a mega church. And he and his wife were both cradle Catholics. And as far as I know, I'm pretty sure they, in essence, renounced their own Catholic baptism to be in this mega church, yet they drop in for the sacraments as well. And so I'm not sure about what I should do in this situation. When I go to communion, when I'm at these sacramental masses for the Eucharist or funerals when they come, I feel very conflicted about it and very tortured in my heart and soul, because I don't know if they know that they're bringing judgment upon themselves. I don't know if they even know the teaching of the church or if they're interested in it. They just think it's fine if they go to communion in their situations. My mom talked to my sister about an annulment proceeding, and my sister said she was not interested. So my mom advised me not to talk to her about it. So I'm not sure what to do. I'm currently going through a divorce. I've been through a recent divorce myself, and am going to be proceeding with an annulment procedure. I thought about asking her if she wants to join me in that, but we're not close enough for me to ask her that. Really, not really.
Yeah. Well, Mary, I just first of all continue to pray. Continue to pray for your sister. That's the first thing, and ask the Lord to open her heart. And then you also may want to visit with your pastor about ways that you can approach this. But the most important thing is that we need to pray, seek God's will, put this person in God's hands, and then talk with our pastor about the situation in ways that, what are ways that you can approach it. Talk with your pastor. See what your pastor has to say about it. But I know if it were my sister, I'd be, first of all, praying that the Lord would open her heart. I'd be talking with my pastor. And trust me, God will present an opportunity for you to, it could be you to talk to your sister about it. It could be someone else that can talk to your sister about it. But pray unceasingly. God will help you. And God bless you for being concerned about your sister, because yes, this is serious. It seems to me that your sister doesn't know that she's bringing judgment upon herself, that she's not aware of what it is that she truly is doing. So that's the advice I can give you.
Yeah. This is sort of a case of a prophet is without honor in their own line and among their own people, because it's siblings, parents, children sometimes don't listen to
Sure.
each other.
Yeah, I mean, I know one thing that I've mentioned to people in the past that they've taken a lot of consolation from is to pray that that God send a Ambrose into their lives. That sometimes when you're close,
An outsider who can parachute in.
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps the Holy Spirit's calling you to maybe ask your sister, why do you receive communion? But you really need to ask the Holy Spirit if that's what you're being led to do, because it's a difficult position to be in, and but yes, sometimes an Ambrose, an outsider who's able to help bring them in, is exactly what they need. So.
And for those who don't know, we're talking about St. Ambrose,
Yes.
who was responsible for bringing Augustine
yes.
back to, because of the prayers of Augustine's mother,
Yes.
Monica. Fraternal correction is the hardest thing to give properly. Fraternal correction given badly can do more harm than good. So it is, Mary, you have to think about, is my sister, are my brother open to what I would tell them? If they're not, bide your time. As Cindy was saying, pray. As Laura was saying, pray maybe that somebody, a third party, can come into the situation and help out. Or you may just drop something, in conversation. You could point them to the back of the Missalette, where it describes, the church has norms for people who are no longer practicing Catholics and for non-Catholics. You don't have to issue a judgment. You just can matter-of-factly point it out to them. But it is very hard. You're as likely to not have any success and have the counter effect as you are to have success, unless you till the soil and water it and plant the seeds and allow God. And I think that's the best advice.
And Colin and our Theology Roundtable panel, your closing thoughts. What should we go with? Go forth and practice what?
Well, I would say, if you haven't read the exhortation, read it carefully, thoughtfully, in light of what we're talking about today. That would be very good advice. As the Pope himself said in paragraph 6 or 7, read it carefully, read it slowly. Don't presume to know you understand it. It does involve some complex areas of Catholic moral theology and pastoral, the application of principles of pastoral theology to difficult situations. So trust in God. God is with the church, and we can't be misled in the end.
Amen. Thank you very much, Colin Donovan, Laura Dittis, and Cindy Quare, our theology panelists here on EWTN Theology Roundtable. I want to remind you that you can chime in with questions ahead of the show, which airs monthly, by going to EWTN.com and type in the search bar EWTN Theology Roundtable so that you can stay tuned. And there are encore times and TV show times there as well. You can check it out to see what is the right time for showing in your area. This is Elena Rodriguez asking you to be one, faithful with the church. And as Mother Angelica always said, God bless you. Stay tuned.